are now going to continue on in our review of the letter to the Romans. And as I said last week, Paul has spent 11 chapters talking about the mercy of God and explaining the ways in which God has done so many things for us. And then in the final chapters, he talks about how we are to respond to what God has done for us. And as I said, that is the pattern that Paul always takes in all of his letters. In all of his letters, he always begins with what God has done for us. And so he says, in view of the mercy of God, offer yourselves as living sacrifices, and that is the proper response. And it is a response. It's not something that we initiate in ourselves. It is something that is the overflow of what God has initiated in us. Our worship, our lives of service are the overflow of that. And then he goes on, as we saw in this passage we had read to us from the second part of chapter 12, he gives a kind of a list, or almost like a litany of things that you can do, some suggestions, if you like, some examples of the way you ought to behave. And we should always say that when Paul does that, he doesn't give an exhaustive list. It's not like you can just look at that list of things he says there, do those things and say, well, that's that done. Because that's just an example. There's a million things you could add to it. And in fact, we've got to nuance it to the particular circumstances you're in. However, the only way that we can live the life that Paul talks about there, or the life that's described in the law, like we had read out to us from Leviticus, that's a description, not a prescription. That's really important we see that. If you think it's a prescript, if you think, if I do this, then God will love me, then you'll forever be insecure. However, on the other hand, if you know that you are secure in the love of God, then it's not a prescript but a descript of what your life can be like. It's the overflow, the outworking of the love of God. Your good works do not secure the love of God for you. Rather, the love of God secures you in doing good. It's exactly the opposite, and it's counterintuitive and goes against the grain of our what I'd call instinctive spirituality. You know, I've told a story before here of a woman who in the past had good reasons to hold a bitter spirit towards me. It may come as a shock that I've annoyed people in my past. And not just not only people who are involved in the service, but it's other people as well. Anyway, this is a long time ago, and so I feel safe to talk about it now, but this woman held a bitter spirit towards me because of an on-field incident that took place involving her son and my good self. And I won't go into all the details, but I moved to Darwin shortly after that so that I would put sufficient distance between me and this woman. And when I say this woman came after me on the field it was on the Port Wakefield football field, and she opened up the fence and got out there, and she was going to come out and have a piece of me. And I've got to tell you, I was actually scared. This woman was, she was a well-known woman in the local area. She drove a bus and had a cigarette permanently sutured to her bottom lip. She had tattoos, and she was scary. She was much bigger than me. And anyway, I moved to Darwin and felt well enough protected there. Years later, I returned to my hometown where I was actually preaching in the church of Balaclava. And some people told me that this particular woman was there at that service and she wanted to see me at the end of the service. So I thought, well, my comeuppance has finally come home and I'm going to have to face the music. And weirdly, amazingly, wonderfully, when I met her, I didn't recognise her. She was a transformed woman. She was different, and best of all, she'd forgiven me. And that's what she wanted to see me about. She said, she actually gave me a big hug, and she forgave me. And I thought her son got what he deserved, but anyway. A mother's love, you know, she's pretty one-sided. But anyway, she forgave me. But the thing that really amazed me was the transformation that had taken place in her. She physically looked different. And when I say physically different, I mean she was beautiful in a way that radiates from the inside. not just the outside, but there was something inside of her which shone. And while I'd been away in Darwin, she'd actually become a believer. She'd had a dramatic conversion. She'd heard the gospel, been absolutely transformed, and something had dramatically changed in her. And she was radiant and of course forgiving. And the question I wanted to ask then is, what actually changed in her? Did somebody hand her a list like Paul's list here in Romans 12, and did she just start thinking, okay, well, I better start doing that? No, something had happened spontaneously inside of her. She was totally transformed, and it flowed out of her, and her forgiveness toward me was not just something she'd worked up, but it was something that had come to her very naturally, along with a whole bunch of other things that had changed in her. You know, I've seen people change for all sorts of reasons, through fanaticism or extremism or patriotism or nationalism, and all of those sort of things will definitely alter a person, but it's not the same way in which someone is transformed by being secure in the love of God. Being secure in the love of God is, I truly believe, is the thing that will change a person more than anything else. In fact, I even heard a psychologist once say there's really only two things that dramatically alter a person. And one of them was the death of a close friend or family member. And the other, this psychologist said, was conversion through the gospel. And they were not a Christian. They were just observing what happened. This guy was observing what was happening with his patients. And that kind of transformation is not the same as the transformation that takes place through inspiration or motivation or information. And look, I've got no problem with inspiration or motivation or information. They're good things. You know, positive thinking is a benefit to you for sure. But it doesn't change you in the same way that this woman was changed. Or other people I've met. You know, I've told the story of a guy that I knew was a triple murderer who was absolutely transformed by the gospel, virtually in one weekend. And it's that change that I want to investigate today, because I believe that's what Paul is really talking about. The thing that really ultimately and deeply changes a person. And in this passage, we see Paul giving a description of the kind of change, not a prescription. And then he goes on to say, and we talked more about how that took place last week, but this week we go to verse 9, where he says, love must be sincere. So if you are truly transformed by the goodness and the mercy of God, looking to the mercy of God, your love will be sincere, not just made up. And when he says love must be sincere, love, what he means by that is true love cannot be faked. Meaningful love to another only occurs when we really know that we are already loved by God in the first place. In fact, the Greek word for sincere here could also be rendered as undissembled, that is, undisguised, without dissimulation, without hiding or hypocrisy, unfeigned and unstudied. As I've heard it said, once you can fake sincerity, you've got it made. Boom. Sometimes I wonder. Yeah, sure. I'm sensing that's not sincere. Anyway, but an unfeigned love, you know, or an unashamed, open, generous love, that's the kind of love I saw in that woman. And I have to say that kind of love comes from a serenity that is authentic and profound. You cannot make serenity, you cannot fake serenity. Serenity has to be real. And that's what I saw in this woman. She was serene in a profound way, and it overflowed in her generous love towards me and towards others. And, I've seen that kind of transformation take place way too often for it to be an anomaly. And by this transformation, I mean the transformation that takes place when a person comes to understand and meet God through Jesus Christ. And I've seen it literally thousands of times now. And it's so often the end effect is generous, profound, unashamed, sincere love. And to me, that's really one of the most consistent signs of someone actually coming into the kingdom of God. Now, someone's going to say, well, sure, I've met plenty of people who've had a dramatic conversion experience, but if you hang around for long enough, it turns out that they're not quite the little sunbeam for Jesus that they originally seemed to be. Now, the transformation that takes place for the gospel doesn't bring you to moral perfection overnight, as I'm sure you're well aware. I mean, take the example of Peter. Peter, not just when he disowned Jesus before the crucifixion, but way after the crucifixion, after the day of Pentecost, after he'd come to understand these things in a more profound way, even after that, Paul had to call him out on the carpet over his cowardice towards the betrayal of the Gentile believers, and then even Paul himself, who had to call Peter out on the carpet, he had a major falling out with John Mark and Barnabas. Anyone who falls out with Barnabas has got to have something wrong with them. Barnabas is like the nicest guy that ever lived. So even, the greats of the New Testament, Peter and Paul, didn't always live the life that they preached about. And, I could cite myself as Exhibit A in this regard as well. I'm not necessarily the brightest star in the firmament of Christian sainthood either. So what Paul is talking about here, he's not talking about becoming perfect. What he's saying is, in spite of your imperfections, you are secure enough to still love. And the great thing about the stories of Peter and Paul is that if you read later in the book of Acts, that John, Mark and Barnabas were great friends. Sometime later they resolved their differences and sorted out, and Peter and Paul did the same. And it's where it ends up that is the big thing. So here's the thing, it's not about getting it together and getting it perfect in this life. Rather, it's what I would call an unreasonable serenity in spite of deficiency, a security in spite of vulnerability, because it's not based in self, but it's based in God. Does that make sense? Like, my peace when standing before God is not based on what I have done. Because what I have done on some days is pretty good. On other days, not so much. And as I've said before, my spirituality goes up and down like the share market. And every now and then, we get a bit of a bubble, and it bursts. And it goes to the floor. So if my peace before God is based on my personal behaviour, then I've really got no real peace, and it will be feigned. It won't be authentic. I knew a young man in my church in Sydney when I was first a pastor, and he was a drug addict and had been famously a drug addict for a long time, from a Christian home, and had been living on the streets. And then when he was about 33, he became a believer, had a profound conversion, heard the gospel, just was an absolutely transformed man. Now, did he get rid of his drug addiction overnight? No, he did not. He continued to have his drug addiction. He was working on that. And sadly, he actually died from a drug overdose. And I had to conduct his funeral. And a lot of his unbelieving friends were at the funeral. And they came to me and said, before the service, so, I won't say his name, but we'll just call him George. So George had a conversion experience, and yet he died of a drug overdose. Does that mean he doesn't make it? And it was a great opportunity to explain, no, it's not based on the perfection of your behaviour, rather it's based on the perfection of God's love. And this young man was secure in the love of God despite the fact that his addiction still ended up killing him. Although there is some conjecture that he was actually murdered, but that's a whole other story. But here's the thing. On his funeral notice, or on his funeral, order of service, on the back page of that, I wrote a quote, which was the last words he said to his mother before he died, which was this: "I know that I'm not perfect, but I know that Jesus loves me." And you might say, oh, that sounds so, what's the word, flimsy. I say nothing could be less flimsy than that. And, you know, if you want to look at the opposite example of that is the older son and the prodigal son story. The older son and the prodigal son story did everything right, but he was insecure. And when he went to his father to complain about his brother, he said, "Look at me and everything I've done. I've been slaving for you my whole life." Notice his attention is on himself and on what he's done, but he's insecure and cannot handle his brother and hates his brother and even ends up despising his own father, even though he's the better behaved of the two. So that's why Paul goes on to talk about the kind of outcomes that take place from a person who's secure. In verse 10, he says, "Honour one another above yourselves." You know, when a person is secure in the love of God, they do not talk about their own spiritual attainment. Instead, it actually sets them up to be truly humble so that they can love others more than they love themselves. Now, to love someone more than you care about your own interests actually is something of a miracle. That kind of humble love can only come from someone who knows that they're already profoundly loved by God. We love as we are loved. Now, I've seen plenty of facsimiles of love which are not really the same thing. Sometimes, and I believe this is what the older son, the prodigal son, was doing, was he was loving his father by doing what his father commanded him to do, but not for his father's sake, but for his own. All he cared about was what he could get out of it. And that's when unauthentic love always has a hook in it. It might look like the real thing, but there's a hook in it. There's always a hook of getting power, notoriety, sex, money, false humility, or whatever else it is. There's always a hook. There's always a trade that's being done. But authentic and magnanimous honour can only come from a person who really understands the grace and the mercy of God. And when they see the largeness, just the overwhelming luxury of the grace of God, then they've got more than enough, not only for themselves, but to spread it around. And it's not based in self. If it is based in self, you see, if your peace before God is based in self, then that means it's a matter of pure luck. If you happen to be brought up in a good family, be well socialised, well educated and wealthy, then chances are you're going to be a really nice person. But what about all those people who are not? Does that mean they're unlucky, too bad for you, you miss out? Absolutely not. Because the love of God is not based on your upbringing, your good behaviour, and being well socialised and well educated and wealthy. The love of God is not lucky, it's universal. And when a person who doesn't have all of the happy circumstances of life can still display security in the love of God, it actually says something profound about the nature of God, not about the person. So like the Isaiah 35, who will be on the highway into Zion? It's the redeemed. It's the rescued. Not the people who didn't need to be rescued, but the rescued ones are the ones who are first in line. You know, it should be true. You should be able to say about a believer things that are true that's got no bearing on their circumstances. I saw a poster for a lost dog. It said, three-legged dog, blind in one eye, crooked tail, recently dissexed, answers to the name Lucky. Or something should be true of a believer. They should be able to say of someone who's a believer, someone who, let's say, here's a person who's from a broken home, divorced, recently released from hospital, answers to the name Blessed. Can that be true? And I want to say, absolutely it can. Because this is what God does. God takes useless, broken, hopeless things and makes them into hopeful, meaningful, profoundly loving, forgiving people. And that is a miracle. And when that reveals itself in us, you no longer have to be self-aggrandizing. It cancels out envy, jealousy, greed, idolatry, addiction, manipulation, coercive control, arrogance, egotism, self-justification and bitterness, and best of all, it gets rid of unforgiveness. And to me, the greatest sign of someone who's been truly transformed is their ability to forgive. As Paul goes on to say, share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality till you get it right. And bless those who persecute you. I mean, blessing someone who persecutes you, that's not something you can feign. You can't make that up. And they're just practical ways to serve. But to me, the greatest sign of someone who's really encountered the love of God is the ability to forgive. And then Paul goes on to say, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn, live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If at all possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. I like the way he puts that. Sometimes you can't live at peace with people, and it's got nothing to do with you. But as far as it's up to you, you can't force someone else to live at peace with you, but you can do everything you can to live at peace with them. And then he says, do not take revenge, my dear friend, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it's mine to avenge, I will repay. And mind you, God's way of repaying people is often to restore them, which really annoyed Jonah, for instance. But anyway, he says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. I was thinking about ringing somebody who supports Adelaide Crows and just sympathising with them this morning. But would that really be authentic? I'm thinking no. But of course, I'm talking about real things, real matters. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard Christians say to me, I'll forgive so-and-so when he apologises. Well, that means that you're not actually ever going to forgive them because you've got a hook attached. And in the Lord's Prayer, one of the ways it's sometimes translated is, we forgive our debtors. Or forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Which means, forgiveness means the person you forgive owes you nothing, not one thing. Yes, they should apologise and they should make recompense. But this has been my experience, at least, quite often that doesn't happen. My enemies hate me, sometimes with good reasons, sometimes without. But you can't wait to forgive someone until they apologise to you, because if that's the way you're going to do it, you're not actually forgiving, ultimately. You cancel the debts, and it doesn't mean that you... And the way this is put, and the way you see Jesus forgive and so on, forgiveness is not weakness, it doesn't give way to evil, it doesn't lie down under it, and it doesn't just get run over. That's not what forgiveness means. Forgiveness actually takes the greatest strength and the greatest security. Only a truly secure person can forgive. If you're not truly secure, you cannot and will not ultimately and magnanimously and freely forgive. But if you are yourself, if you've seen how much you are forgiven, it empowers you to forgive. And like I said before, though, it doesn't mean that you give way to evil. Instead, Paul says, don't let evil crush you, but rather overcome evil with good. Turn the tables. Even the letting someone strike you on your other cheek isn't just giving way to evil. Rather, it is, if we explain the context in which it actually brings shame to the person who strikes you with it on the other side of the face. And he even suggests, like quoting from the Old Testament, he says, if you're, instead of harming your enemy, feed your enemy and it will pour burning coals on their head. And that's a lot of fun. And it's transforming. I mean, Jesus did exactly that. I mean, Jesus was being crucified on the cross and he says, Father, forgive them for they don't know what they're doing. And there was a Roman centurion there, a hardened, hard-nosed, killer, watching Jesus say that, they said, wow, this man, surely he's the Son of God. Not the emperor, but this man, he's the Son of God. And it's a transforming thing. So, in the end of it all, we have to say that all these things that Paul talks about are contingent upon being secured in the mercy and the grace of God first. The first and most significant act of faith is to embrace the love that God has for us. If you do not do that, the rest of it will not follow. Everything else is the logical consequence and outcome of the mercy of God. And in the end, we are displays of the mercy and the goodness of God. We show to the world not how good we are, we show to the world how good God is, how merciful God is. And the overflow of that is that we become merciful, we become forgiving, we become less invested in ourselves. We don't have to tell anyone or show off to anyone. You become truly secure. And that is the greatest manifestation of the goodness of God. Amen.